Hi, it's Katrina. The Chronicles of Georgia. The Georgian Chronicle is a fantastic superstructure built from massive stone pillars in the country of Georgia. It looks like something you might see in a fantasy movie, a Stonehenge full of history. These huge greenish-colored pillars erected at the very edge of a mountain overlook the blue sea beyond. While it looks very ancient, the building was made as recently as 1980 by the famous sculptor Zurab Tsereteli. Even though the monument is so new, it is still rich in Georgian history. Every one of the pillars is depicted with scenes from historical and religious events. Some of these structures are covered in images of Jesus Christ, others with Georgian poets, and some with the most famous people who ever came out of Georgia, such as kings and authors. In total, there are 16 giant pillars, all of them forming a perfectly symmetrical, square, open-air temple. Unfortunately, the Georgian Chronicle was never finished. Zurab began work in 1985, but with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, funds ran out, things changed very quickly, and the artist never got to finish his masterpiece. The Chichen Itza Observatories. El Caracol at Chichen Itza, when you see it from the right angle, definitely looks like a domed observatory. The top of the structure is broken, but it still looks like there should be a telescope sticking out from the roof, and a Maya scientist sitting in there studying the stars. While that's obviously not the case, there is archaeological evidence in this ancient Maya city that El Caracol was used as an observatory. The structure was built around the year 906 as a way for the Maya to observe the sky. One of the issues with living in the Yucatan Peninsula 1,000 years ago was that you didn't exactly have the best view of the heavens. The brush was so thick, the jungles so lush, and the vegetation so tall that the canopy almost always blocked out the night sky. So, in the city of Chichen Itza, they built an observatory on a tall platform that allowed for people to get a full glimpse of the stars high above the trees. The main purpose of this observatory actually seems to be observing the planet Venus. Nobody exactly knows why, but the Maya were obsessed with this planet. They wrote down that it appeared in the west and then vanished in the east, depending on the time of the year, and they knew it took 584 days to cycle around the sun. They also investigated at least 29 other astronomical events at this particular observatory. Archaeologists know this because of these sight lines found inside the structure, which directed the eye toward where the astronomical event was to take place. For example, the summer and winter solstices. The untouched Irish tomb. A farmer in Ireland was working in his field as usual when he found something amazing. Even though he'd covered this place many times before, this time he discovered the entrance to an ancient tomb that had been untouched for 4,000 years. This unbelievable discovery was made on the southern part of the Dingle Peninsula. The farmer had actually been using an excavator to lift up a big rock that was in his way when it revealed a hidden chamber. The rock was actually the capstone to the tomb, and inside was a set of human bones. Archaeologists have dated the tomb back to the Bronze Age, saying it could be anywhere between 2,500 and 4,000 years old. It's a little different from other Bronze Age tombs because the entire thing was built underground. This suggests it could be even older. Michael O'Colleen, a local archaeologist, said it's an incredibly rare discovery because nobody had touched it. It could prove invaluable in the coming months to help reveal more about the prehistoric burial rituals of Ireland. People have been living on the Dingle Peninsula for at least 6,000 years, but this is definitely one of the more advanced tombs from prehistoric days that's ever been found. It would have taken a significant amount of work, suggesting whoever was buried here had been a very important person. Other amazing archaeological sites in the region include burial grounds and beehive-shaped huts built by the ancient Celts. The Coutu Minaret. The Coutu Minet or minaret is an ancient tower from the 12th century that can be found in Delhi, India. It stands over 240 feet tall and looms over the entire surrounding area. It's one of the most iconic monuments in the capital that most people have never even heard of. Most historians agree it was built as part of a celebration of victory and had probably been inspired by similar minarets or tall towers in Afghanistan. It was the first Sultan of Delhi, Qutbuddin Aibak, who ordered the monument to be built in 1192. This was after he defeated the ruling Hindus and took control of India for himself. The tower wasn't finished all at once. First came the base of the sandstone pillar, and then over the course of 3 more rulers, the monument was expanded. It continued to be built upward and renovated until it stood 5 stories tall. It takes 379 steps to reach the very top of the tower, something nobody with a fear of heights should even try to attempt. The tower has survived quite a lot over the past 800 years. It's been struck by lightning at least twice, and the cupola at the top fell over when it got hit by an earthquake. In fact, the tower survived 2 major earthquakes with minimal damage. Besides the tower, there's the fortified complex which houses it, and this place has a controversial history. Hundreds of years ago, 27 Hindu temples were destroyed, and the debris from the temples was used to construct the very first mosque Delhi ever saw. This was all part of the exchange when the Sultan took over and tried to force a religious change across the country. There's also a 20-foot-high pillar here made of solid iron that survived 1,600 years. Among the arches there is probably the tomb of a sultan hidden somewhere beneath the pillar. Iraqi Demon Cave. Archaeologists in Iraq recently discovered a creepy demon cave. They didn't find any actual demons inside, but researchers did come across an ancient clay tablet from 2,700 years ago. On the clay tablet is a horned figure depicted as half human and half goat, basically your typical everyday demon. But to the ancient Assyrians, this demon's name was Bennu. Like the character Satan that came later, he had hoofed feet, a forked tail, and a snake's tongue poking out from his mouth. Even stranger is the fact that the Assyrians believed it was Bennu who was responsible for a very specific medical condition. Back then, any ailment of the mind or body that wasn't sustained in the physical world attributed this to a demon. If someone was blind, if they got sick, or if they were epileptic, it was all blamed on a demon. And Bennu was believed to be the cause of epileptic fits. On the clay tablet, there's even a description of symptoms associated with someone who's been afflicted by the goat demon: seizures, loss of sanity, and crying out. It's shout-out time! Big thank you to Leslie, aka Ivory Princess, and Joseph Thomas for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. Secret Christian town. The ancient city of Marea was a bustling port town located on the northern coast of Egypt during the Roman era. This was long after the days of the pharaohs, when Egypt belonged to the mighty Roman Empire. Marea was likely founded during the conquest of Alexander the Great in 332 BC, but it wasn't for 300 years that it would become a prosperous port city under Roman rule. Just recently, archaeologists came across a mysterious hub built in the city sometime in the 6th century by Christian pilgrims. A Christian hub being built in the 6th century during the Islamic conquest came as quite a shock to archaeologists. After the Romans were gone, the Muslims conquered Egypt between 639 and 646. During this time, they didn't build any additional towns and cities. They did enough slaughtering and there were enough towns built by the Romans and Macedonians that construction was useless. They definitely wouldn't have built any Christian cities. In any case, somebody built a tiny Christian town inside the ruins of a large Roman farmstead. Archaeologists figure this was probably a stop on the way for European Christians to visit the tomb of the martyr Saint Menas of Egypt. They would have crossed the Mediterranean to Alexandria, taken a boat about 30 miles to Marea, and then spent the night there. Kaidin tomb. The Kaidin tomb is where the body of the 12th emperor of the Nguyen dynasty is buried. He was the very last king of Vietnam to build a mausoleum for himself. And even though this great and imposing tomb looks like a dark temple from a bygone age, it was in fact built in the 1920s. Kaidin died before it could ever be completed, and his son, Emperor Bao Dai, finished it for him. Kaidin ruled Vietnam at a time when the world was changing. World War I had just finished, World War II wasn't yet on the horizon, and the world was quickly modernizing. Nonetheless, he continued to build all kinds of impressive traditional structures in central Vietnam, mostly around the Hue Imperial Citadel. His tomb, for example, is unlike any other tomb in Southeast Asia. The gates are decorated with clouds and dragons. The stonework is all black and charcoal colored, giving the place a dark and mysterious atmosphere, and the old king's body is housed at the very top of the structure after climbing 126 stairs to reach the burial chamber. The Viking Beer Hall. In northern Scotland, archaeologists have made a fantastic discovery on the island of Rousay. They dug up the crumbled foundation of an ancient Viking beer hall. Evidence shows the hall was open from the 10th to the 12th centuries, over 200 years. But what makes it a little more interesting than other beer halls is that it probably served only the most respected of the Vikings. It was for elite members of society only, a real fancy club that not just anyone could show up to. He had to be on the list, otherwise you could go drink with the rest of the peasants. There's not much left of this elite beer hall these days. Fragmented pieces of pottery, old chunks of Norse trash, and the busted stones of what had once been walls. But at one time, this thing had been huge. It was 43 feet long, with stone benches positioned along the walls on either side of the building. This was a place specifically for drinking ale and getting rowdy. The beer hall was discovered at the archaeological site of the Scale Farmstead, a Viking settlement that had likely been inhabited for at least 1,000 years. It was archaeologists with the University of the Highlands and Islands who have been digging here for years, sifting through ancient trash heaps and poking holes in the ground in search of discoveries just like this one. Ancient Roman warship complex. Just this year, French archaeologists discovered the remains of an ancient warship complex in Brittany, dated 2,100 years old. The complex was built following the Roman conquest of the lands of Gaul in the 1st century BC, after the Romans beat down the tribes that had been wandering across France. Years later, the Gauls, now integrated into Roman society, went to the top of a hill with beautiful views of the Flume Valley below and built 2 massive temples. Archaeologists believe one of them was dedicated to Mars and Jupiter. Mars was the god of war and Jupiter was the king of the gods. The second temple is a little more mysterious since archaeologists can't tell exactly who was worshipped in it. The complex was used at least until around the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire. In the 4th century AD, it would have gone out of style just around the time that Christianity was spreading outside the capital and into places like France. The construction of the temple shows how the local population integrated with the Roman religion after they were subjugated. Even the rebellious Gaulish Rhydones tribe, who lived in Brittany since prehistoric times, quickly adopted the Roman religion when they didn't have a choice. The Aanta Caves. The Aanta Caves are hidden in the hills of northwestern India, 200 miles from the wild city streets of Mumbai. They were carved into the face of a mountain starting around 2,200 years ago. They were discovered totally by chance in 1819 by British soldiers who were hunting in the area. Ever since, the caves have been a major source of pride for India and one of the greatest places to see ancient Indian art and architecture. Construction here went on up until around 650 AD, or for at least 800 consecutive years. The result is that there are over 30 massive caves that have been chiseled into the solid rock face of the cliffs by hand, each one dedicated to the life of the Buddha. Every one of these is filled with massive sculptures, murals carved into the walls, painted ceilings like at the Sistine Chapel, and monuments you'd never think possible to carve inside it. These days, the Aanta Caves is one of the most popular architectural sites in all of India. There is really nowhere else in the country that compares to the sheer scope of what went on here. It's basically an underground city, which took 800 years of manpower and ingenuity to create. Even more impressive is the fact that it was created entirely by monks, who then lived in absolute seclusion inside the temples and chambers they carved with their own hands. Lombardi Castle. Castello di Lombardia was built in Sicily back in the 1st millennium BC. It wasn't built by the Romans or the Italians, but by a unique group of people known as the Sicani. Over 2,000 years ago, there were 3 main groups living in Sicily. This was at the same time that the Phoenicians and Greeks were colonizing much of the Mediterranean. There were the Sicani in the middle, the Elymians to the west, and the Siculus to the east. The Sicani were arguably the greatest builders of the 3. They constructed Lombardi Castle to be a megalithic fortress which could protect their royalty from any kind of attack. They built the foundations of the fortress on a hill nearly 3,000 feet above sea level. It remained such a defensive stronghold against invasion that no one could conquer it. That is, until the Romans figured out how to slither through the sewer network. And to this very day, it remains standing strong. It was occupied by the Roman Empire, later by the Byzantines, and was such a rock of a castle that it resisted Arab assault over 1,000 years after it was built. But eventually the Arabs did conquer Sicily and they took over the castle. Following their victory, they rebuilt the fortress and turned it into an even stronger fort in the 10th century AD. The castle was later occupied by the Normans, and in the 13th century had even more improvements made, with 20 extra towers added by Frederick II, King of Sicily. These days, the most surprising part of the castle is actually underneath. There is an ancient Sican temple hidden within the tower and walls. The temple was built over 2,000 years ago by a group of Sican cult members in worship of Ceres, goddess of fertility, crops, and motherly relationships. Ceres was once one of the most popular goddesses in all of Italy, worshipped by cults across the entire country. The Horn Fortress. Huacra Pucara is also known as the Horn Fortress, and for good reason. It's located in the district of Pomacanchi in Peru, and was occupied by the ancient Canchi ethnic group. Just like Machu Picchu, this old fortress was built at the top of the highest peak in the region, at the very precipice of a stony cliff with two massive rock formations that from a distance look like devil horns. The history of this place is nothing short of amazing. According to local legends, the Canchi were an ancient race of people who had been living in Peru for centuries. But when the Inca rose to power and began conquering, the Canchi were left off guard and outmatched. They fought a brutal war with the Inca on the slopes of Mount Pinaypampa, but were ultimately defeated. The surviving Canchi then fled to the Horn Fortress, a place they knew was nearly impossible to conquer. They locked themselves up in the fort at the top of the mountain, and the Inca laid siege for 15 days. The Canchi were finally forced to surrender, lest they starve to death. In the end, the Canchi swore their loyalty to the Inca. They were spared from execution, although 100 of their bravest warriors had to have one of their ears cut off to mark them as troublemakers. Following the subjugation of the Canchi, the Inca took over the Horn Fortress. It became a secure residence for the Inca nobility and a center for astronomical observation. The Bellgradic Fortress. The Bellgradic Fortress is like something out of a video game. It's an ancient fortress constructed inside a natural geological formation in the Balkan Mountains, deep in the countryside of Bulgaria. The Romans built this gigantic rock castle in the 3rd century, and it honestly looks like a castle inside the mouth of a volcano. The natural formation is like a mountain of stone, with tall fingers of red rock towering up to the clouds like skyscrapers. The Romans used their ingenuity to construct rooms, pathways, and towers inside of the formation, giving them unparalleled views of the surrounding region. The initial motivation behind the fortress was to protect the gold and other goods that were being transported from the lands of Thrace. After the fall of Rome, it continued to be used by the Byzantines for surveillance. Emperor Justinian I improved the fortress in the 6th century. Then the Slavic people invaded the Balkan Peninsula, the fortress was destroyed, and it remained an abandoned ruin until a period of reconstruction in the Middle Ages. It wasn't used again until the Bulgarian Tsar of Aydin, Ivan Stratsimir, saw its potential and rebuilt the entire thing. Shortly after, he was captured by the Ottomans and executed by strangulation. Hor Bashen. Hor Bashen is an extremely mysterious island fortress located in Siberia. There have been plenty of excavations done here, and yet no one can determine beyond any doubt who built this bizarre place. Most evidence suggests it was a Yughir palace in the 8th century AD, but the history prior to that is extremely vague. We're also not entirely sure when the island was abandoned. Historians have guessed it happened shortly after the 8th century, after the Uyghur left and the island was converted into a monastery. Archaeologists have found evidence of earthquake damage as well as fire damage. There was without a doubt some kind of catastrophe here, but it's all quite strange, and no one has any definitive answers. Let's look at where the fortification actually is. The entire island is covered in walls. It was basically a floating stronghold, as if they had built a castle on the back of a giant turtle. The island is inside Lake Terekol, which itself is over 4,000 feet above sea level. It's in southern Siberia, high up in the Sengelen Mountains, close to the border of Mongolia. In ancient times, the only way to reach the fortress island would have been by traveling thousands of miles across the desolate wastelands of Siberia, then using a boat to cross the lake after bringing your entire party 4,000 feet up a mountain. It really was isolated, which adds to its mystery. It wasn't even excavated until the end of the 1950s. It's shout-out time! I want to give a big shout-out to BC and Grace Makowski III. Thanks so much for watching and supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. Aleppo. Aleppo is an ancient city hidden within the heart of a modern city. These days, Aleppo is more commonly associated with the conflict in Syria than the ancient world. But within the modern city is an old quarter of ancient walls, narrow alleys, and relics from the Bronze Age all the way to the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, many of the older pieces of architecture were ruined in the Battle of Aleppo that happened in 2012, and even more historic buildings were either burned deliberately or smashed to pieces in 2014. But there is one thing that still stands strong in the ancient city, and that is the Citadel of Aleppo. It's located on a hill in the center of the city, and historians agree it's one of the biggest and oldest fortresses anywhere on the planet. It's been continuously occupied for over 3,000 years, conquered by the Persians and the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Turks, the Arabs, and even the Mamluks. The present version of the fortress was constructed by the Ayyubid dynasty following the great ruler Saladin, who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders in the Third Crusade. By the time the Ottomans came into the region, the fortress was used primarily as a barracks. But this ancient fortress still had use in recent years. The French occupied it in World War I, and during the Syrian Civil War, it once more served its purpose as a powerful military stronghold. Old Oswestry Hill Fort. It was during the Iron Age, around the year 1000 BC, that Old Oswestry was built in Britain. It was a monumental hill fort at a time when the region was occupied by what were considered tribal savages. The island of Great Britain was divided into different tribal territories, and each one of these territories was defended by primitive strongholds. They built their strongholds on top of hills, which is why we call them hill forts today. It gave them a great vantage over the territory, seeing as how flat England can be. Even a small hill gave a tremendous advantage. The Oswestry Hill Fort was one of the greatest. It was part of a dense wall of hill forts spanning the border of eastern Wales. But Oswestry was one of the biggest. It also remained in continuous use for a shocking 1,000 years. Excavations were done in 1939 by William Varley, but nobody really took any interest until the 1990s. William learned that the fortress had been completed during 4 distinct phases. First came some inner ramparts in the earliest part of the Iron Age. Then, in the Middle Iron Age, the fort was reorganized and enlarged, most likely in anticipation of an attack. Hundreds of years later came a giant overhaul with a total reconstruction. Each phase saw the fort grow larger and larger, and it remained in use up until the year 43 AD. That was the year the Romans showed up in Britain and started rampaging across the lands. Caran. Caran is the main historical feature of the small Danish city of Helsingborg. It's all that remains of a former fortress tower currently situated in the peaceful Slottshagen City Park above the Old Town. The top of the tower gives a splendid view over the entire city and the surrounding area, but its view 700 years ago would have been significantly different. Even though the tower still stands, it's very old. Caran was built in the 14th century as a Danish fortress and occasional residence of Danish kings. The walls were thick, surrounded by even thicker defensive walls. The royal apartments were situated at the very top of the tower and could only be reached by a drawbridge connected from the defensive wall to the 3rd floor of the tower. It was like an island inside a castle. There was a huge courtyard surrounding the central tower, and layer after layer of defensive walls and archer towers to defend against invasion. There was even a huge moat that was dug out to be 45 feet deep. As you can probably imagine, this felt like a really safe place to hide. The only way in was to swim across a moat while under constant attack by the archers in the towers, then breach a series of nearly impenetrable walls. Sadly, the fortress was mostly torn apart by the Swedish king Karl XI in 1681. The only thing he left standing was the central tower, which survives to this day. Yarberry Castle. Yarberry Castle is in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It's about 2 miles from Steeple Langford village in the United Kingdom. in such a rural part of England that there isn't even any public access to this ancient historical site. These days, the castle has been reduced to dirt. There's nothing here except vague hints of the past in the forms of earth mounds. But long ago, it was a gigantic fortification that played a critical role in ancient England. Its outer ramparts would have stood over 11 feet high, with deep ditches that could swallow a man whole. There were tall ramparts, inner and central defensive positions, and a core enclosure in the center. The main portion of the castle was built starting around the year 100 BC. Pottery discovered here can be traced all the way into the Iron Age with the invasion of Rome into Britain. What this means is that the castle was almost certainly inhabited by the native British before the Romans ever showed up. There are over 130 remains of structures of various sizes in the area, suggesting a large settlement had flourished here with Yarberry Castle as the main fortification. Then it was conquered by the more powerful Roman military. The Romans commandeered the castle, as is evident by the sheer number of Roman artifacts uncovered during excavations. Everything from coins to Roman skeletons. Then, over the years, the castle was abandoned, and it just kind of fell out of use. Azkala. Azkala is an old, dusty fortress in the Kizilkum Desert of Uzbekistan. Historians believe the fortress most likely came into existence in the 2nd century AD, likely built by the Kushan Empire. It may have been part of a series of fortifications that crossed all the way from the eastern part of the desert to the western part. This would have been a kind of border wall to protect the dwellers of the oasis beyond. Each fortification would have been in sight of the other, so that they could send signals if an enemy decided to attack. There are other fortresses in the region, but Azkala is arguably the most interesting. Unlike many of the other fortresses of ancient Uzbekistan, it seemed to also contain rural establishments. There were residential buildings discovered inside the ruins of the fortress, each one equipped with a yard enclosed by a short brick wall. These yards would have been planted with gardens and orchards, and each house was large enough to contain an entire family. Azkala wasn't exactly a settlement or a city, but a fortress complex which accommodated border detachments 1,900 years ago. It just so happened that a couple of families had moved into the place, maybe the families of the commanders, and they brought lush gardens to the desert. Colossi. Colossi Castle is one of the most impressive examples of medieval architecture in the country of Cyprus. It was once a stronghold of the powerful group known as the Crusaders. They used the castle as a main strategic point in the Middle Ages, not only as a place of defense, but also as a place of business. The area surrounding the castle was used for the production of sugar from the locally grown sugarcane. But it wasn't actually built by the Crusaders or even for the Crusaders. Colossi Castle was constructed in the year 1210 by the Frankish military. By Frankish, I mean the Old Kingdom of Francia, which would turn into France. After construction was complete, the castle was handed over immediately at the behest of King Hugh I of Cyprus to the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Now, these are not the same knights you're thinking of. They were more commonly called the Knights Hospitaller, and they were an early Catholic military order with their headquarters in Jerusalem until the year 1291. They were different from the Knights Templar, and that they were more of a religious order that supported the hospital. Their group formed officially after the conquest of Jerusalem in 1099 and still exists to this very day. The Knights Hospitallers played a much larger role in history than the Knights Templar, as they even colonized a small part of America in the 17th century, 4 islands in the Caribbean. As for Colossi Castle, it wasn't occupied by the Knights Templar we all know so well until 1306, just a few years before their order was torn apart. By 1313, the castle was back in the hands of the Hospitallers. The Malta Catacombs. In July of 2016, Mike Mansholt set out to explore the realm of the dead, and then he vanished. Mike was a tourist from Germany who wanted to see the famous catacombs of Rabat while he was visiting Malta. But Mike was never seen alive again. A week after he disappeared, his remains were discovered under extremely bizarre circumstances. All these years later, we still don't know exactly what happened to him. However, whatever caused his death is almost certainly hidden in the secretive tunnels underneath the island, created by a mysterious culture centuries ago. The catacombs of Rabat are truly incredible. Spread like a maze underneath Malta, it is a tunnel system connecting sanctuaries, prehistoric dwellings, and mysterious temples. The system was carved by human hands starting at least 2,000 years ago. Human remains have been found within the tunnels dating back to medieval times, the Roman period, and even earlier. People have loved this place since the dawn of time. Even stranger, archaeologists have discovered skeletons with elongated skulls, which means a certain group of people that once lived here practiced cranial deformation. Since this site is so ancient, there are plenty of mysteries surrounding the catacombs. Stories talk of giants, cyclops, and missing children. So what happened to Mike? 3 days after Mike was officially declared a missing person, an anonymous tip led the police to the Dingley Cliffs, the highest point in Malta. At 820 feet above sea level, the remains of Mike Mansholt were discovered. It wasn't pretty. He was missing organs, his camera, and his shoes. He appeared to have died from a fall, although he also may have been robbed and killed, poisoned, or he possibly died of dehydration. Authorities never gave any satisfying explanation. Many believe that Mike met his fate when he came across something sinister inside the catacombs, and that by exploring the realm of the dead, he sealed his own fate. Fort Bull. In 1756, French soldiers attacked Fort Bull in Rome, New York, during the French and Indian War, which saw the North American colonies of the British Empire fighting against the forces of France. They cut off the supply lines to Fort Oswego and then ambushed the fortress in the night. The French joined forces with native Haudenosaunee warriors and charged the gate. They broke inside and killed every last person they saw. They then lit one of the powder magazines on fire, causing roughly 600 pounds of pure gunpowder to explode. Brian Grills, battlefield archaeologist, says about 60 people defending the fortress were killed in the explosion. The mysterious thing about Fort Bull is that no one knows where it is. Archaeologists have been trying to find it for decades. We know that the British built a new garrison called Fort Wood Creek in the same area after Fort Bull was destroyed, but researchers can't find its ruins. The reason the attack happened at all was that Fort Bull was a strategic military location. It was located between Albany and Fort Oswego, and it guarded the waterway connecting Albany, New York, to Lake Ontario. What they did recently discover were some battlefield remnants. They found French musket balls and shell fragments from grenades that may have been used in the attack on Fort Bull. But for all their research, scientists still haven't found the ruins of the fabled fort that was burned to the ground by the French. Mystery Palace. A mysterious and magnificent palace was recently discovered by Israeli archaeologists. About 2 miles south from Jerusalem's Old City, researchers came across carved stone structures and forgotten relics. Some of the artifacts appear to have been neatly buried, though nobody is really sure why. The palace was built a very long time ago, around the 8th century BC. That puts it in the biblical era when Jerusalem was a Jewish kingdom, what historians call the First Temple period. Based on the fragments discovered, the building was once extraordinarily grand. It had tall, ornately decorated columns and lavish window frames, and was likely occupied by one of the top members of Jewish society. It may have been a king of Judah or a wealthy nobleman. According to the Israeli Antiquities Authority, whoever lived in the structure had a breathtaking view of the entire city. It would have been one of the nicest houses in all of Jerusalem. The palace met a devastating end in the year 586 BC. That was when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, just like it says in the Bible. King Nebuchadnezzar II, king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, laid siege to Jerusalem for 30 months. Then the Babylonians destroyed the city building by building, finally burning down the first temple. The kingdom of Judah was destroyed, and many of its citizens were taken to Babylon as slaves. Whoever it was that enjoyed a life of prosperity in this great palace was likely dead or captive by the time the siege was finished. Lost city of Alexander the Great. An ancient city that may have been founded by Alexander the Great himself was recently discovered in Iraq. It had been hiding under mountains of sand for over 2,000 years. But recently, thanks to new technology, archaeologists were able to use drones to fly over huge patches of the Iraqi countryside looking for ruins. John McInnes from the British Museum said he and his team were able to spot the foundations of several large buildings, including what appears to be a stone press that may have been used in wine production. As of right now, nothing is confirmed, and we have no real name for the city. However, researchers do believe it was built in 331 BC, while Alexander the Great pursued the Persian leader Darius III following the Battle of Gaugamela. During this time, as Alexander conquered region after region, he took over or started new towns that he named after himself. After Persia was defeated, this city became a kind of meeting place between East and West. Excavations have revealed ancient Greek statues, old coins, roof tiles, and other items that will hopefully reveal this city's identity. So I wanted to give a big shout out to Lil M and John Smathers. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like these. The Tennessee Tent Graves. The Tennessee tent graves are a strange thing to see for anyone who doesn't live in the American South. These graves can be found all throughout historical graveyards in Tennessee's Cumberland Plateau. They can also be found in parts of Kentucky, Arkansas, and Alabama. They are called tent graves because rather than a smooth stone slab placed over top of a grave, there were two slabs laid against one another to form a triangle, like the top of a tent. But why did Tennessee, of all places, resort to this bizarre way of burying their dead? It started in the 1800s. Slabs of stone would be placed over grave sites because the ground was considered unstable. People were buried in wooden coffins, but then those coffins would decay, and the grave would sink because the soil was too soft. This created a major issue because people walking through graveyards kept falling into pits and getting tangled up with skeletons. It was also unfortunate because it made life a lot easier for grave robbers who so readily pillaged the dead. And so, for decades, the people of Tennessee buried their deceased loved ones in tent graves. And while such a thing hasn't been practiced in decades, the mysterious graves can still be found in rural cemeteries across the state. Yima Castle. These days, Yima Castle is in such a poor state that it hardly even looks like a castle anymore. There are no more walls, and the only things remaining of the original structure are its foundation and a piece of its main gate. When it was built in 667 AD by the Yamato dynasty, Yima Castle was an impenetrable mountain fortress. The castle was built on a mesa to take full advantage of the terrain, with its walls spanning about 3 miles. The Japanese integrated the walls of the castle with the natural walls of the mountain to make it even stronger. Over 1,300 years ago, this place looked like something out of a fairy tale, with tall walls, imposing stone gateways, and vantage points looking down into the lands below. The whole point of the castle in its prime was to defend Japan against invasion. It was built specifically on the coast of the Seto Inland Sea to defend against the Chinese Tang and the Silla Kingdom of Korea. The Royal Tombs of Ur. Between 1922 and 1934, archaeologists excavated the ancient Sumerian city of Ur, located in modern Iraq. Ur was a legendary place, one of the greatest cities of Mesopotamia at the dawn of civilization. Ur was built during the Ubaid period in 3800 BC, almost 6,000 years ago, and it continued to grow and prosper until 500 BC when it was abandoned. The city was part of the development of human civilization for 3,300 years, an unbelievable span of time, and something beyond the scope of what most people can even imagine. They worshipped the Akkadian moon god Nana and built the majestic ziggurat of Ur, arguably the first true wonder of the world. During excavations in the 1920s, excavators found a deep shaft which led to the royal tombs of Ur. In the following years, researchers unveiled 16 royal burials. They found sunken stone chambers with vaulted roofs similar to the tombs in ancient Egypt. Unfortunately, many of them had already been pillaged by grave robbers. Even still, there were a lot of relics to be found. Everything from golden daggers to statues of gold, and musical instruments decorated with golden bullheads. There was so much treasure even the looters never managed to carry it all away. But beyond the treasure was something horrifying. Archaeologists identified the graves of multiple high-status individuals who had likely been kings and queens. Evidence of elaborate funerary rituals involving human sacrifice was found alongside these graves on an unprecedented scale. Within their graves were the death pits, holes in the ground filled with men and women who had been slaughtered and then tossed inside as sacrifice. Researchers believe the victims were killed to be companions for their king or queen in the afterlife, forced to be slaves to their masters, even in death. Old Pitlochry Church. The Old Pitlochry Church was built in Scotland around the year 1630. It can be found in Fraserburgh, and it has most certainly seen better days. The church is missing its roof, its walls look like they're about to fall down, and the gravestones are stained with years of bird excrement. It looks like any one of the hundreds of old churches gradually falling into disrepair across the UK. But the Old Pitlochry Church has one mysterious feature not all churches do. It has a burial vault. The south aisle of the church served as a family burial vault for the Forbes of Pitlochry from between 1636 to 1781. The Forbes' personal family castle, known as Pitlochry Castle, stands just a little north of the old church on the outskirts of Rosehardy. You can see the old family crest over the western doorway of the church, and outside the church you can find over 100 tombstones. They date as far back as 1643, with some of the earliest table stone memorials being carved with gruesome symbols of mortality, like an hourglass. One of the biggest gravestones on the property belongs to a man named Alexander Swan, who died in 1678. It's decorated with a ghoulish carving of a skull and crossbones. Choff Castle. Historical records show the lords of Ramosk appearing around the 12th century AD in Switzerland. In that same century, they built the oldest part of the Choff Castle, a tower looking out at the grand snowy peaks of the Swiss mountains and down into the forested valleys below. In the 13th century, the lords of Ramosk added to the small tower, improving upon the fortification and building a real-life storybook castle in the mountains. Although for them, it wasn't a fairy tale castle. It was an important fortification which allowed their family to control trade and taxes in the region. Having such a great fortress allowed them to control all the peasants within their grasp and steal their money through the tax system. Unfortunately for the Ramosk family, a family dispute ruined their legacy. A disagreement between the two eldest brothers ended with one of them being murdered and the other fleeing the castle. The castle was then handed over to the Match family in 1369. In 1780, the castle was mostly destroyed. Fortifications built in the mountains generally have a short lifespan due to Mother Nature being unruly. It was a landslide that brought the castle to ruins and forced local lords to abandon the property. Lost Persian military base. 2,500 years ago, Persian king Cambyses II attacked Egypt. It was at the height of the Achaemenid Empire, and Egypt was in serious trouble as the Persians flowed across the Nile and invaded. All these years later, archaeologists believe they have discovered a campsite that was used by the Persians during their invasion of Egypt. It was uncovered in northern Israel and was likely a Persian military base. The structure would have been bustling with soldiers preparing for war. The mighty Achaemenid Empire, or the Persian Empire, was founded by Cyrus the Great around the year 580 BC. He conquered the Medians, the Lydians, and the Neo-Babylonians and expanded his territory. His son, Cambyses II, wanted to continue expanding the empire and destroying enemies, so he gathered a great army and brought them into Palestine. This was where he began to assemble one of the greatest armies the world had ever seen. One of the places they gathered in preparation was this newly discovered military camp. Then, around 520 BC, Cambyses directed his forces down into Egypt. The camp would have remained functional as a kind of depot during the war. The immense army required a huge amount of resources, and so there were supply points all the way from Egypt into Persia, and this was one of them. Thanks for watching! Which of these mysterious ancient places would you love to visit? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time. Bye!